Question: can enlightened or awakened people be evil or selfish? There have been some gurus who have claimed to be enlightened, but who have abused their followers either sexually or through money or manipulation. Is that really possible? Some gurus say that it is, because when you awaken, you see that morality is man-made and you lose all morality. And if you don't have heart or love, you can become very dangerous. Is it really possible for an enlightened person to still be selfish? So obviously this is a very important question, because over the past several decades, many people have experienced finding a spiritual guru, following that guru, dedicating themselves to the guru, and they have, at some point, they have seen that the guru really wasn't walking the talk, as the popular expression is. So people have become disappointed. Some people have given up on the spiritual path. Some people have given up on that particular guru, and they have been left with this lingering question, how is it possible that a person can set him or herself up as a guru, gain a following, seem to have some genuine insight, but still they're behaving in ways that are abusive, selfish, possibly even evil. And so, because it's an important question, I'm going to try and answer it in layers. But the very short question to this, can an enlightened person be evil, is no. If a person is acting in ways that are evil, that person isn't enlightened. But the problem with this is that the problem is words. There are so many examples of people who use the same word, but they have different interpretations of it. So the buzzwords that are being thrown around out there in the spiritual community is enlightened and awakened. And I admit, for a long time, I was really confused, because you watch this video, they talk about awakening in one way, you watch another video, they talk about awakening in another way. So I was really struggling to see, well, what exactly do people mean when they talk about awakening or enlightenment? And my conclusion was that they mean different things, and that's what you have to realize. And therefore, I'm not saying that there can't be some people who are awakened according to some definition, but who can still act in evil ways. And this is where it gets a little bit subtle, but also something that's really important for spiritual people to understand. Because as you grow on the spiritual path, as I've said many times, you're meant to build this discernment. So let's look at this from a deeper viewpoint. And the first thing I would like to say is that there is actually something called, which I would call a false awakening. In other words, we can put it this way, that most people are in a state of sleep. They're actually in what Jesus called a state of spiritual death, as in let the dead bury their dead. Because their minds are completely closed, they have been brought up to believe in a lot of limitations about what it means to be a human being. But then there are people who have awakened from this state of the common sleep. It's kind of like the old fairy tale of the Sleeping Beauty, But there are two ways you can awaken. One is you can awaken in a higher way based on sensing the oneness behind all diversity. And one is you can awaken in the, what I would call the false way or the lower way, where you are awakening from the common illusion through not the one mind, but the separate mind. And so, to explain this a little deeper, let me refer to what I've said in several videos, including one of my breakthrough videos. I talk about there are 144 levels of consciousness that are possible on Earth. And I say that in general, the dividing line, or an important dividing line, is at the 48th level of consciousness. Because at the 48th level, you have some intuitive sense you're connected to something outside your own mind. And this is what I call the one mind, or the Christ mind, or the Buddha nature. So it's the mind that's meant to unify everything. Everything was actually created out of that one mind, which gives us a way to always come back to oneness, no matter how far we've gone into separation. So this is what you gain at the 48th level. You have some sense of your connection to this one mind. And then as you rise up from the 48th level, you increase your sense of connection. Your intuition gets better. You have a sense that you know certain things, not because you believe them, but because you have experienced the validity of them. And so this is what I call the spiritual path. Now, most people on earth are either at the lower levels towards the 48th level, or they're below the 48th level. But the general population, they are not at the very lowest levels of consciousness. So they may be in the 30th or sometimes the high 20th levels of consciousness, but they are not down to the 10th or the 5th or the very lowest level. So most people are trapped there in a sort of in-between state of consciousness. And then when you go to the lowest levels of consciousness, there are people there that from a certain perspective you can say they are actually awakened, because they have awakened from the common delusion, the common level of ignorance. And this has many ramifications, but one of them is, as the questioner talks about, morality. It's very true that there is a certain morality that's man-made. And most people on earth have been brought up, indoctrinated with some kind of morality imposed by their society. And it's a man-made morality. It doesn't mean it's completely false. I'm not saying it's completely wrong, but it has certain aspects. Just as an example, many people in the democratic part of the world have been brought up to pay their taxes. But if you look at the very richest people in the democratic world, they hardly pay any taxes because they hide their money in overseas accounts and tax shelters, and they don't pay taxes. So what you can see from this is that there's a morality that most people believe in, and then there are those who have awakened from this level of morality and seen that, oh, it's just man-made, we don't need to follow it, we don't have to pay taxes, we can hide all of our billions of dollars, and never mind that people are starving or dying. So you see here that when you go to the lowest levels of consciousness, there are people who have awakened from the common morality and seen that it's artificial, it's man-made, and you could say that these people are awakening to their individuality and their right to do whatever they want. And you look at some of these people and you can see that they feel completely justified in not paying taxes, for example. You can even look at dictators who feel completely justified in killing millions of people, even millions of their own people, in order to either preserve their personal power or to pursue some kind of political goal they've set, whether it's the spread of communism or the expansion of the Roman Empire or whatever it may be. You see so many examples of this in history. You see serial killers or serial rapists who are absolutely convinced they have a right to do this. I mean, they have literally no morality, you would say, as it applies to common people. And what you also see is that there are some people who have, as I said, awakened from the common morality through the separate mind, the mind of Antichrist, we can call it, and they've set themselves up as spiritual gurus. And they have claimed that they are awakened or enlightened precisely because they see the common delusion and they see through it and they have awakened themselves from it. But they've done this through the separate mind. And therefore, they are still completely self-centered, self-focused. And that's why they can do these things that you obviously, most people will say are predatory or evil or selfish or taking advantage of people. So this is possible. In other words, once you awaken from this common illusion through the separate mind, there's no limit to what you can claim. And people in this state of mind, they are using what I have called the serpentine logic, where things become so muddled, so muddied, that it's very difficult to distinguish between right and wrong. And that's why they can always explain things away in some clever way. They can always cast doubt into people's minds. And what you typically see that these gurus do is that they attract followers who are actually, they haven't fully taken responsibility for themselves and their responsibility to use the one mind to discern between what's real and unreal. So these people are in a twilight zone. They actually are looking for a guru to tell them what to do. So here comes a person who has set him or herself up as a guru, claims to be enlightened, awakened, and know a lot of things, and seemingly does know a lot of things. So, but what they do is they project this state of doubt into their followers' minds so that the followers are not using their built-in ability to contact the one mind and therefore have clear intuition. The followers instead follow the guru and listen to the guru and believe whatever the guru says. Because the guru has induced this doubt that, oh, I can't really know on my own, so I follow the guru because he's enlightened. And this, of course, is a very dangerous state, and that's why you see many cults that have deteriorated into, the horror example is always Jonestown, where 800 people drank the Kool-Aid with poison in it and died. But there are many other examples of this, where a guru has caused these people to go into what you from a distance can see was a self-destructive spiral, but they couldn't see it when they were in it. They couldn't see it until things broke down. So, okay, so this is the one thing. But then we can also ask ourselves, how is it then possible that people can acquire some spiritual knowledge, some spiritual understanding, and still go into this false awakening? And that's where it gets a little bit more complicated, because in order to understand this, you have to understand that when I talk about the 144 levels of consciousness, I'm talking about a spiritual path. And you typically you become aware of the spiritual path when you are around the 48th level. You can become aware of it a little bit below. You can be a little bit higher when you become aware of it consciously. So I'm not saying that everybody who becomes aware of the spiritual path are at the 48th level, because some can in past lives have gone higher than that, and now they just reawaken to the reality of a spiritual path. But typically, let's say, between the 48th level, you just take one step at a time until you rise to the 96th level. And then the 96th level is this crucial turning point, where you have increased your intuition. You have increased your connection to your higher self, to the ascended masters, or to at least some spiritual teachers in a higher realm. It could be in the mental realm. And so you have some genuine spiritual knowledge, understanding, and abilities. But as I explained, between the 48th and the 96th level, your goal is actually to raise yourself beyond the collective consciousness, what I have called in this video, the common delusion. That we are a human being and there are certain limitations of what we can do and know as human beings. So this is your role. And in order to rise above the common consciousness, which is very much a collective consciousness where people are overpowered by the collective. So in order to rise above the collective, you have to build a stronger sense of individuality. And I look back at my path. I discovered the spiritual path when I was 18, and I started following through various teachings, practices, organizations. And I very much saw this as an individual path. I am raising my individual consciousness above, for example, my family, who are not interested in anything spiritual. So typically we start that way. And so we are rising in awareness towards the 96th level by building this very strong sense of individuality. I am raising myself as an individual being above the mass consciousness. And this is what we need to do. It's like you can say that you're launching a rocket, and a rocket has a bottom stage with a big motor and a big fuel tank to raise it above the Earth's gravity, which is the gravity of the collective consciousness. But then what happens when a rocket reaches a certain altitude? Well, now it has to let that bottom part drop away in order to rise higher, because otherwise it becomes a dead weight that weighs you down. So this is the tricky part that very, very few spiritual teachings out there talk about. In fact, I haven't found it anywhere except in the Ascended Master teachings. And the tricky part is that when you reach the 96th level, in order to go beyond the 96th level, you have to at least realize that this individual self you built can't take you higher. And in fact, from the 96th level and up at least quite a few steps beyond that, you are now starting to dismantle the self that brought you, the spiritual self that brought you to the 96th level. And if you don't grasp that, if you don't see that, if you don't lock into the fact that even this spiritual self is unreal, then you can't rise higher. So let me just explain this in a slightly different way. So there is a very strong collective consciousness on Earth that is very much anti-spiritual. It's against spiritual growth because it's about you're brought up to fill a certain role in society. You're just supposed to fill that the rest of your life. Be a good consumer. Get a job, buy a house, get a mortgage, pay your mortgage, buy this, buy that. Live your life the way most people live their lives in your society, and don't strive higher than that. So this is the collective consciousness that's pulling you down. And it is, of course, very self-focused. People are very focused on themselves and their own lives and living a good life. So you have to pull yourself above it because it's unreal compared to the spiritual reality. Because the spiritual reality is you're not a human being, you're not a consumer, you're a spiritual being. So you have to pull yourself above that. But the spiritual self that you build to rise from the 48th to the 96th level is still in response to, in reaction to the collective consciousness on Earth. And therefore, even though it's spiritual, it still can't bring you beyond Earth. It can't help you ascend. It can't help you permanently enter the spiritual realm because it's a reactionary self in reaction to the collective consciousness. So the collective consciousness is unreal and you're building a self that is freeing you from it, but that self is still reactionary, therefore it's also unreal. In other words, it can't take you into the spiritual realm. Jesus said 2,000 years ago, only the person who descended from heaven can ascend back to heaven, which is what I have explained many times as the conscious you, which has no outer individuality. The outer individuality is something you've taken on. So the spiritual self you build is also something you've taken on here on Earth. And if you don't grasp that, if you don't start questioning this and realizing that even what brought you to the level where you're at, even that you have to surrender, you have to let go of, you have to question. If you don't realize that, you go into, you kind of switch. And even though you're at the 96th level, which is higher than the 48th, you're actually going into, instead of losing your focus on self, you reinforce your focus on self. In other words, at the 96th level, you're meant to see that instead of being so focused on myself and my own spiritual growth, I need to shift away from the focus on self because as I become more and more one with the one mind, I lose the focus on self. And if you don't realize that, and again, it's not an easy thing to realize because there are very few spiritual teachings that talk about it. But if you don't realize that, you will use your spiritual knowledge and the level of awareness you have reached at the 96th level, which is higher than most people have on earth. You will use that to reinforce the focus on self, the spiritual self. So what I'm saying is, the spiritual self, you build it in order to rise above the collective consciousness. At the 96th level, you're meant to realize that now you start dismantling it. It's not happening all at once, you do it gradually. And if you don't realize that, you will reinforce it. And that means you will now say, I'm awakened. And you are awakened compared to the average person. And you might set yourself up as a spiritual teacher. I'm awakened. I'm enlightened. I reach non-dual awareness. But you haven't reached the ultimate awareness. You have just reached a level where you are using your spiritual knowledge and experience to reinforce a separate self, rather than starting to really overcome the separate self. You see, until the 96th level, your task is to rise above the collective consciousness. You are building a separate self. It's a spiritual self, but it's still a separate self. And in order to get beyond the 96th level, you have to dismantle even that self. It's just the phases on earth because the collective consciousness is as it is. But if you don't realize that, you will reinforce that spiritual self you built, and you might set yourself up as a spiritual guru. But because you are now, it's like you have, this is the tricky part, you have some connection to the one mind. You have some insights based on the one mind, and that might very well impress people who are below the 96th level. So you can attract yourself a following who look up to you because you are at a higher level of consciousness than they are. However, what inevitably happens is that you are now using your position to reinforce that separate self. And after some time, that separate self will feel threatened, or maybe from the beginning, the separate self will feel threatened. Because it isn't an ultimate self. It's an unreal self built on earth. So it will feel threatened. And it also may very well reason that common morality of the people below the 48th level doesn't apply to you. So therefore, you need money to build a community. And it's very important for you, the separate self, to build this community. So therefore, it's okay to pressure people to give up all their money for this worthy cause that you see it as. Or you have a desire for sex. You haven't fulfilled your desire for sex, so it's okay to sleep with some of the women who are following you. Or men, for that matter, whatever. So I'm just saying, all of a sudden, the morality that you adopt there is a morality defined by the separate self. Whereas, if you see the need to let go of the separate self, as you shed the separate self, you connect to the one mind. And in the one mind, there is what I would call a natural morality. Because what does the one mind do? It helps you see the oneness behind all manifestations. In other words, I see the one mind in myself. This is usually the first stage. We see the one mind in ourselves. But as we go beyond the first stage, dismantle some of that separate self, we also see the one mind in others. So, if I see the one mind in myself, or experience it, and I experience the one mind in you, I know, I experience, if I harm you, I'm harming myself. And since I'm not stupid, why would I harm you, myself? And this leads to a natural morality. And understand, this is what the question says, that some spiritual teachers say that if you don't have heart or love, you can become very dangerous. So they say that, what I say is the higher sense of oneness, where you see the oneness in all people, that's what they call love or heart. I have no problem with that. That's just another way to say it. But see, as they also say, if you don't have that, if you don't go to that level, start seeing beyond this separate spiritual self you built, then you can become dangerous, because all of a sudden you think, the separate self thinks that it can define what's morally right. And see, this is where something that can be very, very confusing to understand. It took me a long time to work with this, because what actually happens to people at this 96th level is that if they don't see the need to let go of the spiritual self, they don't stay at the 96th level. They actually go below, and they can fall quite quickly. But this doesn't mean they lose the knowledge they have of the spiritual path and spiritual concepts. And it doesn't mean they lose their ability to motivate other people or manipulate other people. And so this is where there are people who have walked the spiritual path, genuine progress up to the 96th level, but they haven't passed the initiation at the 96th level. And now they have gone into glorifying the separate self, the spiritual self, and they now fall below, often even below the 48th level, where they become very self-centered, very self-focused. So, the other thing we need to add, because in order to fulfill this picture, we have to talk about fallen beings. And I have talked about fallen beings in depth in my video about how the world was created. And I'm simply going to assume that you know what a fallen being is. Very briefly, it's a being who has rebelled against the very purpose of the universe, and who is seeking to elevate the separate self, the dualistic self, to an ultimate status in this world. They're basically seeking to make the separate self into a god. And there are, of course, throughout history, there have been some fallen beings who have set themselves up as spiritual gurus, and who therefore have created, a lot of chaos in their movement. And the purpose of this, I mean, not in their minds, but the purpose behind this is to really discredit the spiritual path and the whole idea of spiritual gurus. Because as I've explained before, the fallen beings in general, their main threat, what they feel most threatened about, are the people who not only reach the 96th level, but go beyond to the levels of what you could call personal Christhood. That's the main threat, and what they have done is they've done everything they can to try to prevent this from happening. And one of the ways they've done this is setting up these false beings as gurus to discredit the whole idea of a guru or a spiritual path or higher states of consciousness or awakening or enlightenment. Because people see that here's a guru who claims to be enlightened and then behaves as if he isn't enlightened. And so it casts doubt upon the whole thing. And so this is one thing. But the other thing that you really have to realize is that these gurus, I'm not saying they know they're false gurus. They may have started out in a normal family situation. They may have been more intelligent often than the average person. So there comes a point where this guru now awakens from the common delusion that you are supposed to live, that you are just a human being who is supposed to live a certain way. So from that perspective, the guru has had an awakening. And it now awakens to the idea that all morality is man-made, and all of these limitations that people impose upon themselves in order to fit into society is just all man-made. And I don't have to follow this. I am beyond this. And so now they set themselves up, and they are very, very sure of themselves. They are absolutely sure that they are right. And that absolute surety, some people just, as I said, if they haven't taken responsibility for themselves, they get pulled in by this. They literally surrender to the guru. And then they follow the guru and they believe, oh, this was the ultimate guru, the ultimately enlightened guru. I've seen this with some of these gurus out there. You can find many videos about I don't want to mention names because it's not my agenda here. But, you know, what I want to impress here is that the fallen beings, they often, whether they're gurus or not, they often seem to have knowledge, insight, understanding, abilities beyond the common person. And they do. But they have acquired this through the separate mind, the dualistic mind, the mind of Antichrist. Jesus talked about those who take heaven by force, the violent take heaven by force. Because you can, even through the Antichrist mind, you can take on certain abilities, even certain abilities to create psychic phenomena or manipulate matter, but you can also take on this knowledge and awareness, because many times the fallen beings are extremely knowledgeable about how physical matter works and how to manipulate it. And they're also knowledgeable about human psychology and how to manipulate people, because they've had so much experience with it. So this is knowledge that can be acquired through the separate mind. But what I'm talking about when I talk about spiritual growth is through the one mind. You're becoming conscious that you are connected to the one mind, and you increase that sense of connection until you become more and more one with the one mind. And as I said, at the 96th level, you realize that the self that brought you to that level is just a temporary thing. It's just a vehicle. And you need to gradually dismantle it so you can go higher in oneness with the one mind. And as you do that, yes, you could say you lose the outer morality that's imposed upon society, but you acquire what I said, the natural morality, where, let's put it this way. So many Christians have grown up with this: don't do to others what you don't want them to do to you. And so this is something that has been imposed upon them from the outside, from they were children. They've heard about this. And maybe in their minds they're deciding, yes, I'm going to try to do this. I'm going to force myself to do this. Even if I have a desire to be selfish, I'm going to suppress that desire and force myself to be moral. And this is what some of these beings below the 48th level, they awaken from this and say, oh, this is all man-made. I don't have to follow this. But as I'm saying, as you go beyond the 96th level, you also, it's like you awaken from this morality imposed from the outside, but you actually awaken to the realization that this is a natural morality. When Jesus said, turn the other cheek, this came from the one mind. But you can, of course, use that with the outer mind to try and force yourself. But as you go beyond the 96th level, you stop forcing yourself. And it just comes from within. It just comes naturally. Because you experience that it's based on do unto others. What's it based on? There are no others. And that's what you see when you come into oneness with the one mind. There are no others. Because we are all connected. What I do to you, I'm also doing to myself. And so you could say that, the natural knowledge is that we are all connected. So therefore, whatever I do to others affects myself. And if I'm not stupid, I'm not going to harm others, but because it harms myself. When you go below the 48th level, go into what I call delusion separation, you lose this awareness. You forget this. And therefore you become affected by the most common delusion on earth, which is, I can harm you without harming myself. If I kill somebody and society doesn't find out and put me in jail, I've gotten away with murder. But you haven't karmically. or in your own mind for that matter, in your psychology, because you're still carrying your psychology with you. So this is the common delusion. And in order to help people not make as much karma for themselves, you have created this outer morality. Because if people follow even the outer morality, they're not making as much karma. So they can actually grow in consciousness. But those who are below a certain level, whether they're fallen beings or they're just beings from this sphere who have started to see through the common morality, they will see that the common morality is just man-made. But they are not seeing, because they are not connected to the one mind consciously, they are not seeing that they are harming themselves by harming others. So they think, oh, I don't need to follow the common morality, I can do whatever I want because it isn't going to harm myself. If I, for example, hoard billions of dollars and put it in an offshore account so I don't have to pay taxes, it's my money, I can do with it whatever I want, it doesn't harm myself. Because you're not recognizing that, first of all, you're making karma by doing this, and it's going to haunt you in coming lifetimes. But second of all, by being so selfish, you're in a selfish state of consciousness where you're constantly paranoid and feeling threatened. So you are not living in you have all this money, but you're not really living in a very comfortable state of mind. Because your psychology is your psychology, and you can't run away from it. So all I'm trying to say with all of this, I know I've gone on, as usual, too long, is that, in my view, an enlightened person truly cannot be evil. Because in my view, an enlightened person is one who has started uniting with the one mind, where you see that the one mind is in me, the one mind is in you, therefore I don't harm you because it will be harming myself, and that's stupid. And if people haven't grasped that, they can still have insights, abilities, especially abilities to impress others or manipulate others, so they can set themselves up as spiritual gurus. But they're not actually enlightened, even though they claim to be. They may seem to be because they have these abilities and they have this knowledge, but they're not. And, you know, I heard one spiritual guru say that, well, it was a situation where something had happened in this guru's organization. And there was a person asking, how come you didn't know, how come you allowed this to happen? And the guru said, well, I didn't know that these other persons were doing this. And then the person said, well, you claim to be enlightened, how could you not know this? And so the guru says that being enlightened doesn't mean you know everything. It just means you know yourself. And yeah, it's not necessarily a wrong statement, but which self are you knowing? Because there are some of these beings who are in this very low state of consciousness, or fallen beings, they will say, I know myself, but it's the separate self they're talking about. And if I have a right to do whatever I want. But if you really know yourself, you know yourself is ultimately, in an immediate sense, it's the conscious you, which has no outer personality, therefore has no desire, therefore has nothing, no agenda, nothing that needs to happen on earth. And then beyond that is the I am presence, which is not in duality. And beyond that is the Ascended Masters reaching all the way to the Creator. So human know thyself, you know, is this hierarchy going up. But you can also say, oh, I know myself as a separate self, and I know what I'm capable of and what I have a right to do. So you see again how words can be used for different things. And okay, one final thing. What I have talked about here is that as long as you are an embodiment on earth, you are below the 144th level of consciousness. You are walking this path where you're gradually going up towards the 144th. At the 144th level, you can consciously choose to ascend, because you can look at earth and you can say, there's nothing that pulls me back here. Nothing I want to do that I haven't done, nothing I want to experience. I'm done with earth. I can let it all go. And So what I'm saying with this is that enlightenment for many people, or even awakening for many people, seems to be a permanent state, an ultimate state. But it isn't. Nothing on earth is ultimate. I don't care what you call it. Enlightenment, awakening, spiritual growth, Christhood, Buddhahood, whatever you want to call it. Nothing is ultimate. Because the ultimate state of consciousness in our world of form is the Creator. And that is, I can assure you, so far beyond anything that can be reached on earth, that it's ridiculous for people to think on this planet that they have reached some ultimate state of consciousness. I mean, when you have experienced just a glimpse of the Creator's consciousness, you see that on this low planet, an unnatural planet, it's just ridiculous to think you can reach an ultimate state of consciousness here. It is completely ridiculous. And in fact, if you think you have reached some ultimate state of consciousness, you are trapped in the separate self. Because this is the separate self, the quest of the separate self, is to take something here on earth, something that per definition is relative, and elevate it to an ultimate state. It elevates itself to the status of being a god. That, my friend, is not enlightenment. And it never will be, no matter how cleverly people in the serpentine mind attempt to explain it as if it is some ultimate state.